Good afternoon, everyone. It looks like it's 1 o'clock. I'll just give a couple more minutes for folks to get back from lunch. Hopefully people had a chance to have lunch. So we'll just be starting in a minute or two. Thank you. A minute feels like a really long time, doesn't it, when you're waiting? So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Welcome back. My name is Marie Raup. I'm the Assistant Director of Compliance here at CBH. And this afternoon, we have two presentations. First, we're going to have representatives from the Attorney General's office. They're going to talk about their unit and I think talk about some cases. And then we're going to have our own Lauren Green and Keela Reynolds, who are going to talk about some hot topics, not hot pockets, as we all keep saying. And those are some updates on self-auditing, our fraud, waste, and abuse hotline information, and the per diem substance abuse documentation guidelines, also a handful. Or a mouthful, excuse me. So first I'm going to introduce our two representatives from the OAG. These guys work with us on cases. They are our partners in detecting crime, and we're very happy to have them here with us today. So for us are Beth Madigan, and Beth Madigan has been serving as a Senior Deputy Attorney General in the Medicaid Fraud Control Section of the Criminal Law Division of the Pennsylvania Office of Attorney General since 1999. Prior to joining the Attorney General's office, Beth was a prosecutor in the Delaware County District Attorney's Office, where she prosecuted all types of cases ranging from juvenile crimes to homicides. Beth graduated from the Pennsylvania State University in 1989 with a BS in economics, and she graduated cum laude with a law degree from Villanova University School of Law in 1992. She's being joined by Jennifer Snur. Jen has been employed by the Pennsylvania Office of Attorney General for 22 years, all of them with the Medicaid Fraud Control Section. She started as a special agent working both care-dependent neglect cases and Medicaid fraud cases. In 2013, she was promoted to a supervisory special agent position, specifically for the care-dependent neglect team with statewide responsibility. Currently, she is the Director of Outreach for the section, which is how they ended up here with us today. As the Director of Outreach, she has the ability to travel across the state to speak on abuse and neglect in all care settings. Jen came to the Attorney General's office from the Pennsylvania Department of State, where she was employed in an investigative capacity, and prior to that time from the Pennsylvania Office of Inspector General, where she also worked as an investigator. Jen has a BA in English and a Master of Science in the Administration of Justice. So thanks so much, guys, for being here. I'm going to turn it over to you. Just FYI, there are no slides for this presentation, but it is part of the recording. So thanks so much. Take it away.
Hi, Marie. Thank you so much for offering to allow us to speak today at your compliance forum. Some of you are already familiar with our office, the Medicaid Fraud Control Section. But for those of you who are not, unlike any other law enforcement agency, we specialize in criminal cases of abuse and neglect, as well as Medicaid fraud. And because of that, we have the very special resources and knowledge to do these cases, but oftentimes we are not brought into these cases until later on in the time. So part of my job as Director of Outreach is to get out and talk to people and to increase the quality and quantity of our referrals, which is why I'm here today. So I'd like to start today by giving you a little bit of an overview of the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office. We are the state's top law enforcement office, and the Attorney General's office is divided into 4 divisions: the Criminal Law Division, the Civil Law Division, the Consumer Protection Division, and the Outreach and Public Engagement Division. And they go out and they do education for the public. So the Medicaid fraud control section is one of many sections that is a part of our criminal law division. We are funded by federal and state dollars with the mission to protect care-dependent Pennsylvania citizens, as well as to prosecute Medicaid fraud. So the Medicaid fraud control section employs a variety of different disciplines that enable us to work as a team. As our name suggests, we employ attorneys. We also employ agents and analysts, auditors, and support staff. And additionally, our section normally employs a full-time nurse investigator. Unfortunately, that position is currently vacant, and we are in the process of hiring a nurse investigator. The Medicaid fraud section has 3 regions. I am out of our central region, which is in the Harrisburg area of the Commonwealth, and our headquarters is also out of that central region. We have a western region in North Huntington, and we have an eastern region in Norristown. And the staff in those regions are responsible for the counties that surround their region. So in the eastern region, they cover the 5 counties surrounding Philadelphia. In the central region, we cover 38 counties in the central portion of the state, and the western region covers the remaining 24 counties. And in addition, currently, we are lucky enough to have an attorney who's staffed out of our Erie BNI office, who covers not only Medicaid fraud, but he also works on insurance fraud as well. So although we have very specific and limited jurisdiction, which is Medicaid fraud and abuse and neglect of care-dependent people, we often identify other crimes during the course of our investigations. And when we do, we can prosecute those other crimes. So for example, in Medicaid fraud cases, sometimes we will identify other crimes like, say, theft by deception, false reports, maybe forgery, possibly insurance fraud, drug diversion, and maybe tampering with public records. Anything that we find during those cases, as long as we can prove that, we can charge those cases. So any related offenses that we sometimes find in neglect and abuse cases may include homicide, aggravated assault, maybe reckless endangerment, and also sometimes theft. Again, if we find those in our neglect cases and abuse cases, we can also charge that as well. So I told you already that we are in, well, really 4 different counties across the state with 3 regional offices. As such, we are not set up to be a first responder agency. You know, being out of 4 counties in a total of 67 counties, you know, we're not set up that we can just be anywhere at the drop of a hat. So we very much rely on referrals. We can't get involved in cases if we don't know what's going on. So we receive referrals from a variety of different sources. We receive them from other state agencies like the Department of Aging, the Department of Health, the Department of Human Services. In neglect, we receive a lot of referrals from our county area agencies on aging for our protective services and adult protective services. We also receive referrals frequently from local, state, and federal law enforcement. And we do monthly proactive report of need reviews where we go to our different partners and we talk about, primarily for abuse and neglect, we talk about reports that they have received over the past months so that we can identify potential reports of abuse and neglect that we did not receive, and sometimes Medicaid fraud complaints.
And Jen,
yeah, go ahead.
If I could jump in there, since most of you are going to be dealing on the fraud side, I would like to point out where we get most of those referrals. So most of our referrals that we get on the fraud side are coming from the managed care organizations. So CBH has been a longtime partner with the Eastern Regional Office in referring those type of complaints. I can see some names on here, so I don't know who's here, but I would point out that we get a lot of referrals and sometimes they come directly, but usually they're coming through CBH from provider agencies like yourselves. Because you guys, as Jen said, are the people that are out there on the front lines and getting this information. So the majority of our fraud referrals are coming through managed care organizations. And I would say the vast majority of those referrals are originating through compliance units at various entities. Sorry, Jen.
No, that's okay. Thank you very much, Beth. So we investigate provider fraud, not recipient fraud. The Pennsylvania Office of Inspector General investigates and prosecutes recipient fraud through the individual county DA's offices. But as an aside, with some of our cases now, it's not out of the realm of possibilities that we might be prosecuting a recipient for their act as a provider, like in home care cases, when you have a recipient who is also a caretaker and is working either for or through a Medicaid provider. So as a rule, we prosecute provider fraud, but sometimes our defendants are also recipients. We can also prosecute those who conspire with providers to defraud medical assistance. And I believe that Beth's going to talk to you about some of these specific provider types that we have prosecuted in the past. But we look at doctors, dentists, nurses, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers. There's maybe 50 some Medicaid providers that we look at, all with different rules and regulations. Subcontractors and employees of providers would include administrators, therapists, therapeutic support staff, mobile therapists, behavioral specialists, consultants, home health aides, those types of people. And we prosecute individuals or agencies as appropriate. We follow wherever the evidence leads us. We might start a case that's looking specifically at an employee, but during the course of our investigation, if it takes us up the corporate ladder to the supervisors, the management, the executives in a provider corporation, then we will charge whoever the evidence leads us to charge. So I'm going to no, go ahead. I'm going to turn it over to you anyway to talk about the law.
Okay. Thanks, Jen. So thank you guys. If anybody's upset that we don't have a PowerPoint, don't blame that on Jen, blame that on me. I've sat through a bunch of trainings in the last few weeks where people read their PowerPoints to me. All I saw was a PowerPoint on a screen and they read it to me. And to me, that was brutal. I could have read it myself. So I apologize for those of you that like PowerPoints. But we are here if there are questions, and we're going to have time at the end for questions. But in the meantime, if you have something, throw it in the chat. We'll try and I have it monitored here as well. And I know that CBH is always good at making sure I answer any of those questions. So I have prosecuted both neglect and abuse and fraud. I mainly focus on fraud, which is probably why most of you are here. And have been doing so, like Marie said, since March of 1999. I have been in the Eastern region my entire career. Not that I haven't prosecuted cases throughout the Commonwealth, but the majority of my cases have fortunately been down in the Eastern Regional Office. And when I have done behavioral health cases, even if they weren't in Philadelphia, CBH has been more than kind enough to educate me on a bunch of the issues that come up. So I know you guys come from all different types of provider types. We have charged various behavioral health providers throughout the state and specifically down in the Eastern Regional Office. We have charged social workers who have forged their credentials. We have charged behavioral specialist consultants who are working at 6 different places at the same time, many times, including the city of Philadelphia. We've charged TSS workers. We've charged psychiatrists. We have charged mobile therapists. We have charged doctors. We have charged people involved with various types of case management services. You name it, we have probably charged somebody in there. And we charge them with various crimes depending upon where the evidence goes. But the Medicaid fraud statute in Pennsylvania is the majority of what we use to charge. And the Medicaid fraud statute does not require that payment is made. The Medicaid fraud statute talks about submitting false information. And that's what we're looking at. Now, you're going to be like, well, wait a minute, we all make mistakes. Everybody makes a mistake here and there. Absolutely. What we're looking at are criminal cases. Throughout the country, Medicaid fraud control sections have to exist. It is a federal requirement for a state to get federal funds for its medical assistance program. Most states have both civil and criminal authority. In Pennsylvania, I think we're one of 7, Jen, if I'm right. Very few, a handful of states that do not have civil authority. So we are only looking at cases in the Medicaid fraud control section on a criminal aspect. Any regulatory or civil authority lies with the Department of Human Services. So with that said, to make out a criminal case, it's not a mistake. We have to show that there was criminal intent, that it was knowing and intentional fraud. Clearly, if you are providing social work and saying you're providing social work and you aren't credentialed, you know that. If you use somebody else's license to get your job and put your name on it, it's a pretty easy criminal case on our side to show criminal intent. And why do we do this? We are all in this together. The agencies, the Attorney General's Medicaid Fraud Control Section, the Department of Human Services, and CBH, we all have the same goals. We are here to make sure that individuals get services that they need. We want to make sure that if somebody's saying they're providing services that this individual needs, that they actually get it, right? That's our first goal. Our second goal is to make sure that the taxpayers are getting what they're paying for, that they aren't paying out for somebody who's not providing services. And why is that important? Because as you guys are probably more well aware than we are, there's only so many tax dollars to go around. There's 1 million people that need services, especially on the behavioral health and drug and alcohol side. And there's only so many dollars to go around. So every dollar of fraud that we prevent from occurring means somebody else can get those services. So we do look at it as a cooperative effort. The Medicaid fraud statute is very specific in that if you submit false information, that's criminal, with criminal intent, if you knowingly, intentionally. What does that mean? If you say that, if I submit a claim saying that I provided services that I didn't, that would fall under our statute. If I submit a claim saying that I provided social work services and I'm not a licensed social worker, that would be a fraud. If I am a social worker and Jen's a social worker and we're both licensed, and I submit a claim that says I provided the service when Jen did, that can also be Medicaid fraud. So there's a variety of aspects, but pretty much when we boil it down, I always like to say it's services that aren't rendered, right? If I'm a doctor and I give somebody a script for drugs, and I did that without having a physical exam, I did it in exchange for sex, which we unfortunately see all too often, right? That's a service I didn't provide. I didn't provide medical services in order to get that script. If I bill for 10 units and I only provided 2 units, that's 8 units of services not rendered, right? If I bill for individual therapy, but I provided that as group therapy, that's a service not rendered. I didn't provide individual therapy. So I always like to tell people that's the bottom line. As Jen said, we can charge whatever crimes arise out of our investigations. So normally, in order to get Medicaid, to commit Medicaid fraud, people are committing other offenses. Generally, they're committing a theft. They've taken money that they're not entitled to. Generally, they have tampered with public records, whether they're electronic or written. Those records are required to be kept, both the time records and the clinical records. And I, in particular, always make sure I charge that, because in addition to you stealing money, in addition to you not giving this person services that they need, that somebody's determined that they actually need, in order to commit this crime, you also falsified that individual's medical records, and other individuals rely on it. And we're going to talk a little bit later about some of the investigations we've done in cases. But when I show people those records, they get really upset. They're like, this didn't happen. This never occurred. And that's in their medical record. And I think that's really important for people to look at, because a lot of times what we hear and what Jen as an investigator hears is, it's no big deal. Everybody's it's just, they're stealing from the government, which once again is you and I, by the way, because those are our tax dollars. But it's not. They stole from the individual who was supposed to get services. And I don't think there's any one of us that would want our medical records to be altered to contain false information. And so what we're all doing here is very, very important. Now, as we're going to go through this a little bit later, and Jen's going to talk about some of the things that you guys can do to help us out on investigations. It's important to point out that we're not here to charge people who shouldn't be charged. We're not here to charge people who made a mistake. And the laws are very strict on what evidence we need to prosecute. So the cases that we have charged are very solid cases. They are cases where we have evidence not only beyond a reasonable doubt, but generally beyond a shadow of doubt. If I have BSCs that I have charged who literally report being in 6 places at the same time. 6 places. Not once, not twice, day in and day out. And what we have seen is they start small. If you see it at the beginning, you can see there's like a little bit of overlap. They see if they get caught. You can see it expand, and it expands out. And those are the things that we use to show the criminal intent, that this wasn't a mistake or it wasn't an accident. So we appreciate your time and letting us talk. Like I said, we charge all sorts of crimes when we charge these offenses. It is important to note that the Medicaid fraud statute, if you are convicted of that statute, it is an automatic 5-year exclusion from being a participant in the Pennsylvania Medical Assistance Program. And at the end of those 5 years, the individual or entity would have to reapply. It's not an automatic reinstatement. In addition, we are federally funded. We are required to follow federal law. Every person that we charge and convict, we have to report to the federal government. And when people are convicted, even if it wasn't of Medicaid fraud, if it's arising out of Medicaid activities, it gets reported to HHS, to their exclusions program, and there is a federal exclusion as well. And they go on the federal exclusion list that a lot of you have to check if that's part of your job through the compliance department. So we are required reporters there. It doesn't matter if they're convicted of theft, if they're convicted of forgery, doesn't matter that it's not Medicaid fraud, they still end up being excluded through that federal system. I have found that the new exclusion portal has made the process much quicker, that those exclusions tend to show up fairly quickly. When I first started and everything was on paper, it could take months and months and months. But that is a huge consequence. We are aware that that's a huge consequence, and that's why our standard for arrest is not probable cause, which is what the standard is. Our standard is, are we going to be able to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt? That's what we charge on at the Pennsylvania Office of Attorney General Medicaid Fraud Control Section. And that's whether it's a neglect case, because once again, when we're charging people with neglect, that can affect licenses and everything else. So we are well aware of the consequences and how it can affect people's lives. Now, with that said, I will point out, since this is the law section of it, that there is in Pennsylvania a first-time offenders program. It's called ARD, Accelerated Rehabilitative Disposition Program. And some of you may have heard about it. You hear it on TV sometimes for first offenders for DUI. There are instances where we do put first-time offenders into that program if circumstances warrant. But what I would caution people, and for those of you that are giving training to your employees and your members, is that is not a favored program by the federal government. the federal government really does not want us giving anybody that program. And what that program does is if you successfully complete it, you come out with no record, okay? Even if you go into ARD, for Medicaid fraud, you're going to be excluded. So it's really important for people who are providing services to understand what the consequences are for reporting services that weren't provided. And those consequences can be extremely severe. And they should be, especially with what you guys do. As I said, behavioral health, to me, this is the most important issue in our country right now, are drug and alcohol abuse and behavioral health issues. And if we have individuals who are supposed to be helping people with those issues who are not, it affects everybody. So it's really not about stealing the money, which is why actually getting any funds isn't an element of the offense. It's this false information that really is the charge. That is the crime. The amount of money that's stolen goes back to restitution. But once again, everybody's focusing on the crime itself of somebody really putting in false information. So I know there's a couple of questions in here, and if you bear with me for a second so I don't forget, I will look at them. An example of the two social workers where one writes notes for the other. What if there's an emergency and one staff writes the note on behalf of the other, but clearly indicates in the note that the service was provided by the other staff? And we're going to get into that later. That's a great question. That's what I'm going to tell everybody. That would be the training that I would give to everybody. If something unusual happens, and things happen, right? Then then document it, and document it at the time. You don't want to try to be explaining it to my agents later when they come in, right? And writing a note, that's easy enough, right? I'm writing this on behalf of somebody. If it's an emergency, if it was me, I would write that in. What we're doing with the two social workers is, maybe for some reason it's billed under Jen's name instead of my name, because maybe I'm not an actual provider with CBH, or I'm not credentialed with whoever. So we see that, right? But yes, obviously there are reasons, there are issues, and documenting it at the time, and I think Jen's going to get into that in a little bit, that's very helpful, because it helps us to not get those cases in the beginning, right? If you as a compliance department is looking at this and you see, wait a minute, there's a note written by Jen, but we billed it under Beth, but you see why, and it's documented, you're not going to send that to CBH and us, because you're like, okay, this is legitimate. But if it's not documented, everybody's like, oh, wow, that causes all sorts of investigations. So it's in everybody's best interest to have that documented at the time. The other one was, once someone is reinstated after being on the exclusions list, is their name removed from the list? If so, is there any way for providers to know if the person's fraudulent history? I am not an expert on exclusions. CBH may know that more than I do. I believe that there's a current exclusions list, and I believe that it's only the people who are currently excluded. Ken and Marie, or anybody, you guys might know that more than me.
Yeah, that is my understanding. And so the history would then show through the background checks that you're required to do for staff as well.
Right. And so that was going to be my comment. Now, Jen's going to get into this a little bit in the investigative stage, but yeah, you guys do a criminal background check, and that's going to show you the public information, right? So if somebody went on one of these diversionary programs, that's not going to come up. If they're convicted of certain offenses, those don't come up. We have access to all of that information, but it is not public. And I know Philadelphia has different rules on what they're allowed to ask, not allowed to ask, but I do know that you guys run criminal histories, and we're going to get into that a little bit later, but that would give you the public history of what they've been convicted of that you're allowed to see at this point in time. So hopefully that helps answer that question. Okay. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jen, who's going to talk a little bit about what you can do to prevent fraud or identify it quickly so that you can minimize financial losses and make sure that everybody's getting the services.
Thank you, Beth. So like Beth said, the most important thing here is that you're providing behavioral health services to people who absolutely need those services. That is of utmost importance. And, as much as you can try to prevent it, you should try to prevent it. But if not, you should try to identify it as quickly as possible. So one of the ways that you can try to prevent these cases from occurring is you can provide education to your providers. Talk to your people about this. Medicaid fraud is a felony. There are collateral consequences. Beth talked to you about that. You, as providers, have access to your members. You have access to the providers that actually provide the services, as well as to all the documents. So like Beth was explaining, fraud boils down to services that are not rendered, and that includes inflated hours, and includes wrong services, things that you're trying to bill and misrepresent as something else. And I haven't done a lot of a lot of cases recently on behavioral health cases, but I have over the years. And every time I've ever investigated a behavioral health case, I always thought, these people spend so much time in college, they spend so much money in college, to get into this field, and then they commit a crime, they commit a felony. And, what a waste of their time and their money when they're going to lose their career. Like Beth said, they're going to have 5 years at least that they're going to be excluded from the program. They're not going to be able to do what they studied to do. And for what exactly? So I think that the education for your providers should include at least the following areas. So time in and time out must be actual and accurate. And I can't tell you how many times as an agent that I've tried to explain this to people. Actual and accurate means actual and accurate. It should be the time that it is. It shouldn't be what you stretch or what you estimate. It shouldn't be anything less than what it is, the actual date, the actual time, actual and accurate. Like Beth said, documentation is created by fraud is incorrect. And it puts incorrect information in those members' medical records. Not only is that unfair to your clients, but it could be very damaging. And very much like Beth said, I remember, reading these records prior to talking to these families, primarily when you're talking to people about their kids, and they get very, very angry when they read some of these records because they're clearly false. And it's made for some very good cases on our part when we share these records with them, and they can tell us exactly what was wrong, and even things that they wouldn't be able to remember without reviewing the records. By reviewing the records, they can tell us, this date is wrong because it was my birthday, or, we've never gone to that person. We don't talk to this person. Just, you wouldn't have any idea what to ask if not but for the records. But when you read the records, you can go off the records and see what is in fact true. So what starts out as a way to cover up their crime then ends up being, something that creates a permanent record, which again is real problematic. So signatures.
I want to, if I can, Jen, just jump in there. And that's a really important point that Jen just made. I've done a lot of grand jury investigations where I've brought in various medical assistance recipients. And a lot of them are not law enforcement friendly at the beginning. They don't like us. They don't want to talk to us. And I've had them look through the records ahead of time so that they're not sitting there looking at it in front of a grand jury. And it has been eye-opening. It's one thing to say, did you get services? And I think we're going to go through that later, but please don't ask that question. Ask like, oh, what services are you getting, right? Don't ask if they're happy, right? Because they're happy. They were all happy until they read these notes, right? Because they didn't know, oh, wait a minute. I was supposed to be getting services 4 days a week. I was supposed to be getting services for 8 months. Yeah, I got them for 3 weeks, right? I was happy till I read that. Was I getting all my services that I thought I was supposed to be getting before I read this? Yes, I was. And there are questions we don't know to ask. I will give just a few examples because I talk for a living, obviously, right? But I had one lady who was reading a case, reading the notes about one of her kids. It was a wraparound case. And she's like, this didn't happen. And I was like, okay, why didn't this happen? And she says, I don't know anything about this date. She says, but this person keeps talking about taking my kid to the park around the corner. I have never lived anywhere near a park. I don't have a park. My kid doesn't go to a park. There's no park around my house. There's nowhere that you could even mistake as a park. And very adamant. And we wouldn't have known to ask that. Like, that's not going to jump out at us. I had other individuals who were in for a case involving women who were transitioning from from shelters to the community who had dual diagnosis issues. And they read through it and they had a bunch of things that I never would have asked. You know, one was like, I had a lot of workers. None of them were ever male. Okay, that's helpful to me. That's also believable. Other ones were like, wait a minute. I know I wasn't at a shelter during this time period, like they said, because of this. And they had specific reasons. I had other ones who were just got emotionally upset because it talked about something about their kids that was just untrue that allegedly they had said. And they were adamant. And I bring these people before the grand jury then, and the grand jurors are just fascinated because they believe it. We did a trial, I think Marie, it wasn't her case, but she was down helping me out for it in Philadelphia. And I had a mom and she did not like us at the beginning. And then she read all of these false things about her son. And she testified before the jury, and the jury was mesmerized by her. And this is a mom who has very little education, who has very little means, who came in her best outfit and was just, it was heart-wrenching. And it showed that this was actually about a person. And the defense attorney started to say something, I don't even remember what he said, but she got on that stand and she was like, my son has issues, but he ain't stupid. And that never happened. And the place went silent. And that jury came back with a conviction in no time at all. And the reason was because the things she was saying, they were all believable. Nobody can say, unless you have a calendar, which most people don't, nobody can say they weren't at my house last week. But they can say, and what everybody believes is, I know this didn't happen because at 7 o'clock, I start baths for my kids, and nobody who is not in our family is allowed at my house. That's believable. That's things we all know about. There are things we don't know to ask because it depends on who it is. So I just would implore you, when you're looking at this stuff, what Jen's saying about the documentation and talking to your members, I just think it's so important when you're doing your compliance reviews. You know, don't just ask, are you getting all your services? Are you happy? Maybe have them spot check, maybe show them some of the notes. I think you're going to get a much better view of whether services are really happening or not. And it works both ways. I've had people say, no, we're not happy, when my agents have asked that question. I really hate that question. My agents all know not to ask that question now, right? That doesn't mean services weren't rendered. You know, particularly in peer support specialists, where people are court ordered to participate in drug treatment program that they don't want to be in. If the person's actually making them do everything they're supposed to, they may not be happy about it, but that doesn't mean the services weren't rendered, right? So what you guys want to know in your compliance is whether these services are being rendered and they're being rendered properly. And I think that what Jen was talking about with talking to the members and showing them documentation, it's really going to help you guys out in making that determination on, are your employees or your contractors doing what they're supposed to be doing? Sorry.
No, that's okay. I'll go back to the education of the providers. So we talked about time in and time out should be accurate. We talked plenty about documentation. Also signatures. Signatures from parents or clients or teachers represent a verification of services. All signatures that are signed by somebody other than the actual person don't necessarily constitute forgery charges, as in order for us to charge forgery, just like any other charges, we have to meet all the elements. However, I would highly say that it is never a good idea to sign anybody's else's name to, to this or anything else for any other reason. I don't care if somebody tells you to, and if the services were provided, and if everything's on the up and up, I would still say don't do it. If you can't get the signature from your parent or your teacher, then, be upfront and honest about it. But I think that's something that you need to tell your provider. It's never okay to sign for somebody else. Like Beth said, document. We always say that if you didn't document it, it didn't occur. And there are all sorts of things that you need to document in the records, so that when we're looking at those records, and keep in mind, we look at it, through an investigative eye. That's what we're initially relying on in those cases. We're relying on what you wrote in your documentation. If you didn't document it, it didn't happen. And there could be good and valid reasons for whatever it is you did. Just articulate it in your documentation. Documentation should be very good and very accurate. I think sometimes providers, at least that I have seen in my cases, kind of blow that off, or kind of, cut and paste their documents from one visit to the next. And, we look at that before we go out and we talk to the clients to see if there's any kind of patterns. So documentation is not anything you want to shortcut. And I think that's something that needs to be talked about with the providers. So as far as education to the providers, I don't know that I have anything else more to say on that. Actual and accurate, good documentation, signatures on the up and up, and, tell your providers that they shouldn't be having people sign blank, or multiples of any documentation. At least that would be in my opinion for that. In addition, I would also say that, again, like Beth said, you should conduct quality interviews of your members. You have the ability to talk to your members, and I imagine that you're already doing this. And like Beth said, there is a way to do it that you can be very general. Don't ask those open-ended questions where you're like, are you just happy? Because again, like Beth said, happy could be any one of a number of things. Remember that Medicaid recipients don't receive explanation of benefits. So sometimes when we ring a doorbell and we want to talk to a member about services, they have no idea why we're there. They don't understand, they don't know what's being billed for them. They don't understand sometimes what kind of services they're supposed to be getting, even if it's their children's services. They don't know how much or how frequently they're supposed to be having services. So, it's good sometimes. It's good sometimes when you talk to your members to just kind of let them go. Ask them the questions, what kind of services do you get, and how frequent are they, and on what days are they, and how long in duration are they, so that they can tell you what specifically they get. So open-ended questions, again, like we all said, Beth and I both, review the notes ahead of time so that you know what's being billed specifically and what they're saying, that they did. Ask your members about signatures. How often do you sign? Do you sign in the beginning? Do you sign in the end? Do you ever sign blank sheets? I think that sometimes parents don't know how important it is to, again, sign these forms so that they're verifying a service. So they don't necessarily look at what is specifically, indicated on those forms as to what service is being billed for. So, ask them if they've reviewed those forms before they've signed. And now go ahead. I can see your.
No, I'm reading the chats, and I know you're on your phone, Jen, so
Yes.
I'm luckily on my computer, so I'm reading chats just while we're in that. It says here, sometimes people are reluctant to include some very specific detail, as records can be subject to subpoenas and court orders where such information can be damning. I'm not really sure, how, if you write the truth, that's going to be damning. Yes, it's true. Records are subject to subpoenas, court orders. Records are also subject to review by governmental agencies. All of you are providers in the medical assistance program, and that means that you have to provide your records to us, to CBH, to any other entity, DHS, that has that oversight. And that's why it is important to be specific. If, you know, you're taking, if it's true, the truth doesn't change. That's what I always tell people when they testify. So if there's something damning that happened, personal example, I just had a case in Philadelphia. I screwed up sending the offer. And so we were stuck with that offer, and I gave it to the defendant. We went before the judge. We sent the offer. We said, this is the agreement. The judge is like, this guy has a criminal history a mile long. Why is this offer being given? To which the defense attorney said, can we talk in the back? We walked in the back. I said, Judge, my fault. I screwed up. I inadvertently sent the wrong offer. We're bound by it. I'm happy to put that on the record. I put it on the record at the lower court. And he was like, that's not necessary, and accepted the offer. I screwed up. Is that damning to me? It is. It's going to come out at some point anyway. I documented it in everything I did. I kept the emails where I sent the wrong offer. I didn't try and hide it. I think it's not just for criminal purposes. The world realizes that we all make mistakes, and we own up to them. And I certainly wouldn't want to be investigated for fraud because I made a mistake that I've owned up to. So, you know, that's where people can be reluctant. But if you're asked the question and you're under oath, whether you wrote it down or not, you're going to have to give the honest answer. Otherwise, that's perjury, which is also a felony. And that's whether it is in a civil proceeding or a criminal proceeding or a deposition. And if it's written down at the time, you're not going to get into the whole, you made this up because of this litigation. So that would be my response to that. The other question, Jen, was, sorry. Can you speak to fraud as it relates to organizations not training or properly training staff for negligence? Have you brought charges against leadership for willful negligence, for not properly training, knowing that prohibited charges would ensue? I'm going to let Jen answer that in just a second because she does more on the neglect side. I will tell you that a lot of that, what you're talking about, is generally going to rise to the level of civil neglect, but we do have criminal neglect charges, and those charges are very specific on what we have to do. So where there are instances where there is not proper training and it causes criminal neglect, those are the type of charges that our neglect of care dependent person team that Jen has been so intimately involved with will bring charges. We always get the answer, and I'm just going to throw this in here, every time we go out and talk to somebody who we believe is committing fraud, or when we're doing a fraud investigation, I will tell you it's never their fault. The agency didn't tell me. The agency didn't teach me that. Some unknown person at the agency said, you don't have to do that. Some unknown person never told me. So this brings up another good point on the agency side. Keep track of your trainings. Keep track of what you told people. Keep track of attendance at your trainings, so that when the person comes back to say, not my fault, the agency didn't tell me or told me I didn't have to do that, you as an agency have that backup. But Jen, if you want to talk a little more about the criminal neglect charges that have been brought.
Okay, so in criminal neglect, a person has to act intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly. And when I explain that, a lot of times what we see is recklessly. It's not like what you see on Dateline or, you know, on those TV shows where people get into, you know, healthcare so that they can actually hurt people. So oftentimes what we see is recklessly. Training is a big thing right now. Staff is very hard to get, and a lot of these jobs are very difficult. I do a lot of cases involving group homes, as well as I've done nursing home cases and in-home cases. And a lot of the times when you're caring for people who are care dependent, these jobs are very difficult. You're doing all of the things that somebody who is not able to do because they are dependent upon care. You're doing those very personal things for them. And that is very difficult. So what we look at your training and your education. So if you are a CNA versus an LPN versus an RN, right? A CNA has less training, less education, less experience than, in doing some of the higher up functions than an LPN than an RN, right? So we also look when we're doing these investigations at facility or, company provider training records to see if they were in fact trained. If so, we try to flesh that out. How was that training? Was it in person? Was it by computer? Was it hands-on? Right now we have a company that does most, and I think with COVID, a lot of them did most of their trainings online. And a lot of the staff that we've interviewed were like, well, we just click, and kind of went through it. So, it probably didn't sink in. So we take all of those things into consideration when we're looking to see if we can prove that that person in a neglect situation acted at least recklessly. So does that answer your question about training?
I think
we also look at experience as well.
I think it was more on the facility side, and we have charged facilities for not properly training individuals or not having adequate staffing. If it's something where the regulations would require, for example, 2 people on a transfer and they're training, oh, we don't need to do that. That's one. Those are cases that we've brought. I know that's not really what you guys do, but it can go into behavioral health type group homes, things like that. So
we start out looking.
We
start out looking at the specific incident or event, but as we're looking at that incident and event, we look at supervision. We look to see if those people were supported. Did they have extra staff? Did they have knowledge from the upper ends of people who should have known, who should have helped? So we follow our evidence. If it's just an incident and the staff that was hands-on were the only people involved, they were, they acted of their own accord without any kind of involvement from anybody higher up, then that's where that case might end. But if not, and we go up the chain, we can certainly charge, supervisors or executives or management, depending on their level of knowledge and their level of involvement.
Okay, so there's 2 questions, and I know there's one before this, but since this one followed up on that, I'm going to go through that one first. Are those cases published somewhere? So when we arrest somebody, all criminal cases are public. At the beginning, you can Google, if you know the individual, you're going to see it. You can go in and go into the state database. Generally, when we charge a lot of these bigger type cases, our office will put out a press release. Sometimes that gets picked up by the local press, sometimes it doesn't, but the attorneygeneral.gov website has press releases on cases where we have charged. The United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of PA covers the Philadelphia area. They charge a lot of cases as well. They also do civil false claims cases that we don't have authority over. They also have on their website, it's not every case you charge, but the bigger cases, those are all published there. So that would be the best way to go look for that. Back to the original questions, sorry, before this, the individual said damning to the client in family court case where such information that was private info is now public. That's first of all not true. Family court cases are not public. They're, and I'll go back to the website. I see you guys putting in things, so I will get to all of them. So family court is not a public forum. Also, if you're dealing with protected health information, that can all be filed in court under seal. And under the new statutes, even in criminal court, anything that I have that deals with protected information, which includes public information, that has to be filed with a special format, so it is not public. Even though criminal cases are public, there's an actual form that I have to file on confidential information. When my agents file a criminal case, anything we file now with things being online, people are very careful about it. There's check boxes where you have to put down whether this is stuff that can be public or not. So it really needs to be in records, and family court records were never, ever, ever public. They were never public. But as far as what those records are, even in criminal cases, even going way back to when I first started in the DA's office in 2000, all the medical records, any behavioral health records were reviewed in camera. Sometimes they're reviewed by the court and not given to the other side. In a criminal case, we turn everything over to the defendant, but it's all protected. It is not allowed to be released to other individuals. And when we file things in court, they're filed confidentially. They are still not open to the public. So there's a lot of stuff that happens on TV that's really not right. So don't believe everything you see on TV. There was another question. Oh, somebody put in, thank you, the attorneygeneral.gov website. They put it into the chat. Also, if you want the U.S. Attorney's Office, the easiest way to do it is just Google U.S. Attorney's United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of PA, and their website's really easy to go on and see what public information they have. And thank you, Emily, for putting in their site as well. Okay. I'm sorry, I think that was all the chats. Jen, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay.
Yep. So I know that, and I don't know if now's the time you want to talk about that, but I know that we were asked to talk about or discuss providers who wanted to know how that they could tell who the bad employees are so that you don't hire them. So I know Beth and I discussed this a little bit, today, and I know that I'm going to let her discuss it, but that you can do your due diligence. And there's many ways that you can do your due diligence to the best, of your ability, but I will let Beth cover that as well.
So Ken brought up a good point earlier. You guys are running criminal histories for individuals. I know a lot of times you'll allow the individual to provide a criminal history that they got from a different entity. Jen and I would both advise against that. Both of us have had cases individually where we've prosecuted people who have falsified that criminal history. And so, that's one way. Now you know what their criminal history is, their public criminal history, which is all you should know. I mean, if they were charged and not convicted, that's not something that should be held against somebody, right? The other thing that we have seen is, you ask for references, you ask where they worked before. A lot of entities will call using the number that the person provided. Don't do that. Don't do that. A lot of times it's their best friend who's also committing fraud. We see it. Like, we'll look at the names. We're like, yeah, we had a case against that person as well, right? So if they say they worked at ABC Behavioral Health, go in and get the number for ABC Behavioral Health and ask to speak to their personnel department and get the information directly from them. Then you're not calling the person's best friend. You also want to verify their education. Don't just take their transcript and assume it's accurate. Don't just take their license and assume that you have a copy of their license and it's accurate, especially this day and age. I am not great with computers, but it doesn't take a lot to falsify diplomas. It doesn't take a lot to change a name and print it out and have it look real. You can go through the Department of State website to determine that somebody's license is actually accurate and in good standing. We have done search warrants. We did search warrants at a location. I don't even remember what kind of case it was on. And my agents came back with a whole bunch of blank Temple diplomas. People had blank Temple diplomas. I think they were probably selling them to people. So, you know, computers are a great thing, but they've also made it very easy to alter and change documents. We do through our investigators, and our experts have ways to prove that those are fraudulent when we charge somebody, but you guys want to prevent that from happening at the beginning, which we understand. So the best way to do that is to go directly to the source, get a release form so that the school will give you the information and not claim that it's protected under FERPA. Go directly to the Department of State and make sure that the individual is actually licensed, that their license is in good standing. Call the previous employers. I know that a lot of times they can't give out information. We get it, lawyers, I get it. We're terrible. We are. I agree with you. I do reference checks, and we get a release from the individuals to be able to check their references. If they don't want to sign that, that's kind of a red flag, right? So get a release, provide that to the employer. Find out if they were eligible for rehire. Would they be willing to hire this person? I mean, when I do references, really, you're giving me references of people who should give you a glowing recommendation, right? So every now and then I get one where the person's like, yeah, they were good. They showed up. And I'm like, wow, probably not the person I want. So, when they're providing you with their credentials, I know a lot of times when we get the credentialing file, they provided you with trainings they've received from different agencies. Look at the resume they provided. Are those entities not on their resume? I wonder why, right? Maybe it's just that they went there for training, but you can ask them, right? Is there a gap in their resume? Are there reasons for gaps? There are, but I can't tell you how many times I ask that when I'm interviewing somebody and it's like, oh, well, I worked here, I just didn't put it on. That's kind of a red flag. I was meeting with an agent actually on a behavioral health case this morning. And we know that they were let go. It's a case CBH has referred to us, as a matter of fact, and they were let go because they didn't have the proper credentials, and they were told that. And then they went and did the same thing at a next entity. Shockingly, when we looked at their resume for the second entity, they didn't put the first one on. They never put that one on, right? Why? Because it might come out that they didn't have the right credentials and they knew it. So what can you do to make sure you don't hire them? Can you be sure? You can't. We're all going to get bad employees, right? But the biggest thing that I would say is, and this happens in government too, you have a bad employee, you have somebody who's committing fraud, you're required to report that, right? Report it. It's always easy to be like, oh, they resigned, they're not our problem anymore. And that's true. They're not your problem anymore. They're somebody else's problem. And that doesn't affect you. The problem is everybody else is doing that too. So you got everybody else's problem. So it does affect you. So, that would be the biggest thing that I would say is make sure that it's reported. Because if there is an action, whether it's criminal or regulatory, that can be taken against that individual, then they're not going to be somebody else's problem. And if everybody does that, you're going to have a lot less bad employees. The other thing that I have found is, as Jen said, is the education. I have heard in wraparound a million times, well, everybody's just having them sign blank forms. Well, everybody does this. There are a group of people who are going to commit fraud no matter what. There are just people that are criminals. And there are people that are never going to commit fraud because they're rule followers and they do the right thing to almost a full, right? And then there's the majority of people who are in the middle of that. And if they are convinced that, well, everybody's doing it, it's no big deal, this is the industry standard, then they're going to shave the rules, right? If they know, hey, you can't do this, people are looking at it, people go to jail, people lose their license, people lose their livelihood, people have to pay back restitution. And oh, by the way, the Medicaid fraud statute restitution in Pennsylvania says that you have to pay back all of that money, including interest at the minimum maximum lawful rate, which minimum is 6%, up to threefold the amount. I can tell you every time I've calculated that, it is at least double and usually close to that threefold amount. So you're going to have to pay the money back. You're going to have to pay it back with interest. You are going to get arrested, potentially. My agents are going to put you in handcuffs. In Philadelphia, you are going to sit for 12 hours with people who are convicted, who are being charged with homicide and robbery and theft until you're arraigned, even if we've agreed that you will be released without posting bail. You're going to sit for at least 24 hours in Philadelphia waiting to get arraigned. These people, if they think that's going to happen and they know that's going to happen, they're not going to do it. So now we're down to this small group of people. And I think that's the biggest thing. There is just the word out there that it's no big deal. I will tell you, we do not have a threshold. You can't steal $5,000 and get away with it. That's not how it works. There is no monetary amount that you can steal and it's okay, right? So I think that education is there. And like I said, I think the other thing is most people really are trying to do the good thing. But they think they're only stealing from the government. And even when I tell them, well, you're stealing from like your neighbors and your relatives because they are like the government money is your money. I think more so when you put it down towards you're stealing from these people who are the most vulnerable people in our society that you have gone to school to learn how to help, that's a different perspective. I think when you give them the perspective of you are falsifying medical records because that's the only way to commit the fraud, like that's a little different than I'm just shaving a little money from the government. They take my money anyway, they take too much. So I think those are the biggest things that you guys can do. I do see some other questions, so I'm going to go through anything on the horizon as far as helping our MCO partners like CBH to identify individuals who are overlapping coverage services between different providers. Individuals' NPI numbers would come up in the claims data, although unlicensed folks would not. Great question. Are you like a plant for me? So with CBH's help, other managed care organizations, and a variety of behavioral health and other medical assistance providers, we did a grand jury report. I believe it came out in 2018. That is public. It is on our website. You can go look at it. And that grand jury report recommended this to Pennsylvania. It recommended three things. It recommended that every claim include the actual person providing services. And that could be done through an NPI number, or that could be done through a state issued number. Doesn't matter who it's being billed for, but that would need to be done because when I started, everybody was a provider. Now, almost nobody's a provider with a provider number. It's an entity. And CBH and us, nobody knows who's actually providing the services. And that includes people with NPI numbers. I prosecuted a psychiatrist. He was convicted for the second time. He has an NPI number, but all the psychiatric services were being billed under agencies. He lived in Pittsburgh. He was billing for providing psychiatric services in Philadelphia and also for two agencies in Reading that overlapped. He was also billing for those services when his license was suspended because he failed to pay alimony to the Allegheny Court of Common Pleas. So nobody knew that. Nobody knew he was submitting claims for 6 weeks when he didn't have a valid DEA number and he didn't have a valid license, because nobody knew from the claims data that he was the person providing the services. So that was the first grand jury recommendation. It's very clear. They also recommended that for services where it's relevant, that the time in and the time out be reported on the claims, that it be the actual date and the actual time, not span billing. And their third recommendation was that the state require that all non-licensed providers be required to receive training. And that training would include how to report fraud and abuse, not just financial, but physical, because we had heard from a bunch of people, like I knew other people weren't providing services. They were committing both fraud and potential neglect. And I just kept getting the runaround. And the agency didn't know who to report it to, or the agency was complicit, or the agency was involved. So those were the three recommendations. We have diligently worked in this office to get that legislation passed. We have also partnered with that, some legislation to update the Medicaid fraud statute in Pennsylvania to more accurately reflect the times and the way things are done in healthcare now with managed care organizations. There is legislation pending, but it really hasn't seen a lot of movement. We have had a lot of resistance, some of it coming from state agencies. Hopefully, maybe now that there will be a new governor who happened to be the attorney general when that grand jury report came out, maybe our legislation will be pushed forward in the future. But it is a very big issue. And, CBH, I know, is looking at ways to see if there's a way they can do things to make sure they know who's providing services, because the problem, what we heard from the agencies, and I knew this because I've been doing this for such a long time, like you as the agency don't know that the person working for you is working for 6 other agencies, right? They're not putting that on their resume. They're not. And you can ask them and you can tell them they have to write down where they're working, but they're not going to tell you, right? CBH sees the claims data, but it doesn't say who's actually providing it. So it just says this many units are being provided by this entity. CBH has done a lot, with their requesting rosters to try and do what they can, but I think it's a legislative fix that needs to be done. So, that is there, that is pending, that is stuff that you can look at. And, if you have people in power that you want to call about that, yeah, it would be helpful, because, the agencies you guys are there, you want your people to be getting services. And I realize that there are handcuffs. The other thing is that CBH can only see CBH's claims. Like, so even there, they don't know if the person's providing the services were clients of other counties, right? Because CBH can only see CBH's claims. So it is a huge issue. I see that I've seen multiple folks who have made self-reports now that word at other agencies. Yeah. So, if people know that people are working at other entities, like let CBH know that, let Magellan know that, let CCBH know it, whoever. I know you guys don't just have clients in one county. And then they can look into that and make the reports. You can always make a report directly to our office. They're on our website, which they already gave you. There is a place to fill out a complaint that can be referred to us. In addition, I'm in the Eastern Regional Office. Questions, concerns, call our office, ask for me, ask for one of my supervisory special agents who are the equivalent of Jen. If you have a question, and we'll do our best to answer it. We don't give out legal advice. but we can point you in a direction or tell you if it's something that we would be interested in looking at. But CBH is your first line of defense, and they are one of our best partners statewide in trying to root out what really is fraud and when people really are doing a good job and there's just a mistake. The other thing is to try and educate your members. And I know this is hard. It's very intimidating for somebody who has an 8th grade education and might have their own issues to, if somebody who they trust has a PhD or a doctorate and comes in and tells them something, they want to trust that that individual is right. So it really is educating people on, don't sign blank forms. Don't, here's the services you're supposed to be getting. And I know you guys tell them all that, but as Jen said, when my agents go out, they really don't know. And why don't they know? Because the worker might have told them, oh, no, that's the way it was, but now you only get this. Or, yeah, I provided these services to your kid at school, but the teacher wouldn't sign the form, right? And that might be true. Usually it's not, but it might be. So what the worker should be doing is saying, teacher, I provided these at school, teacher A wouldn't sign the form, and document that. They shouldn't be having the parents sign it, but you are educating your members, your clients, whatever they're called with your entity, I think is also a really, really helpful resource to make sure that services are being provided. And the other thing that we do see is that we see sometimes other providers that work for your agency will know that services aren't being provided because maybe the member tells them, or maybe they see that things weren't done. And having some sort of reporting system for those individuals as well is also helpful, where they can report it either officially or anonymously. We hate anonymous reports, so we understand that. But if somebody can give details on like how they know this and why and what to look for, that might be helpful too. But we're all going to have bad employees. I mean, that's the reality. Anything I missed there, Jen?
Nope, I think you got it all.
So, we are happy. I think we have just a few minutes left. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take them orally, not just in the chat. And, we realize that what we say is not something that all of your entities can do, that you guys, this is just our opinions on things that we have seen and heard throughout the years. And obviously our opinions can be wrong. They can be unworkable for maybe your entity. They're take them for what they're worth with what you guys do. And we do appreciate all the work that everybody does every day. So.
Jen and Beth, if I could ask, while folks may be typing questions in the chat, and just for my own clarification, we get told sometimes, well, there was an investigation either by you or by the feds, and charges weren't brought, therefore everything's okay. And what I reply back is, well, that's not necessarily true, because HHS, OIG, the state, OAG, they only bring charges, especially the state, since you guys only have the criminal charges you can bring forward, when you can meet the burden of proof for those criminal charges. It does not necessarily mean that there hasn't been a violation of our rules or that things weren't done incorrectly that we would still recover money from.
Yeah, that's correct, Ken. And what I should say is we don't find people innocent. Even if we go to trial and they're found not guilty, it means we didn't prove our case or somebody didn't believe it. Nobody's ever found innocent, FYI. But yes, we are looking at things beyond a reasonable doubt. I can tell you, I've had people that I know that they're not doing services. I know it. And I probably have enough to charge them, but I don't feel like I have enough to actually convict them criminally, and we don't bring those charges. I will tell you, a lot of times they come back and I get them eventually, right? I have one, it's been 3 times. I'm sure at some point that individual is going to get charged. So yes, it doesn't mean that everything's right. It doesn't mean that there isn't a regulatory violation. Even investigations that we look at criminally, we get a lot of referrals, especially here in the East. We have a lot of staff, but we don't have enough staff to look at every referral that comes in. So every potential fraud referral that comes in, if we looked at it, we would come to a grinding halt. So we kind of have to make decisions on, are we going to accept it or aren't we going to accept it for a full investigation? It doesn't mean that there wasn't fraud there if we don't accept it. It doesn't mean that I couldn't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. It's a numbers issue. So I think that the regulatory individuals and the civil authority are very important. And yes, even at the U.S. Attorney's Office where they have civil authority, it's limited. It has to be a False Claims Act. So it doesn't mean that something wasn't done improperly. It doesn't mean that there aren't things that can affect licenses. We've had the Department of State who regulates licenses where we haven't brought criminal charges because we didn't have enough. They can still bring an enforcement action against people's licenses, and all of the information that individuals get have to be reported to those entities. So I think that's a complete accurate statement that, this has a lot of potential ramifications that aren't criminal, that aren't the U.S. Attorney's Office or the Attorney General's Office or even the Department of State on a license. It might affect your ability to be a provider within a network. I see it with all the MCOs, behavioral health and physical health and CHC, where people are terminated from being a provider. And some of these programs, especially with what everybody here does, if you can't do this in Medicaid and Medicare, pretty much you're out of a job. So it has an impact. And we want it to have an impact because we want to make sure that people really are getting what they're entitled to.
Yeah, and I appreciate your help and I appreciate you coming today. And it's just to loop back to that very first question, I think, where we had about somebody who didn't provide the service writing a note. That would be an example that I would throw out to the group as something where that's clearly, as written, there's not intent that you guys are going to prosecute. I don't want to put words in your mouth. But for us, we would have concern that there's still a note being written by somebody who didn't provide the service. So we would view that as problematic. And so just to encourage providers, if you question it like that, if you have the question running through your head, good resource would be to call us or to email us at that CBH compliance contact, and we can work through it with the providers. But thank you again for taking time out to do this. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you, guys. Like I said, if there are any further questions, Ken and Marie have our information, both Jen and I. Our office, we are public servants. We are here to serve the public. So they can always provide that if you have any further questions, concerns. Jen, I'm going to do a plug for Jen too, is that in addition to outreach that we do with managed care organizations, Jen does outreach for agencies, for private services, and for members. She does team up with our education and outreach unit. They do stuff that concerns financial exploitation and scams and all sorts of stuff. So if anybody thinks that would be valuable to their members, feel free to reach out to Jen and she can get you in contact with the right people. While we are criminal prosecutors, our goal would be that we would be obsolete. I don't think that'll ever happen, but our goal is to prevent it in the first place. And that's part of our performance standards with the federal government. It's not a notch in our belt to have 1 million prosecutions. We prefer not to have any. So thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. So we can move on to our next presenters, unless anyone has anything they want to put in the chat. Any further questions, comments for these guys before we let them go? Okay, awesome. So next up, we'll have Lauren and Keela, who are going to do our hot topics.